can a very rich person with significant business interests in the country and abroad be a good president and or good leader? And of course, can that same person implement reforms in general, and especially reforms that relate to his or her interests in particular? And I think the historical record is pretty clear. I mean, we've had tons of billionaires and millionaires and kings and queens and counts and dukes running countries, and some of them have been very good and some of them have been very bad. I'm not sure that they're necessarily doomed to be good or doomed to be bad. I mean, it seems to depend on their personal qualities. Sometimes the money and the contacts they have make it easier to implement change and be a good leader. Sometimes it makes it harder. But there's nothing a priori about this. I mean, that's what I object to. I mean, the way in which the question is framed suggests that there's only one answer, and the answer is that no, there are many answers. And we know this from history. I mean, one would like to say that billionaire presidents are bad for America in light of our most recent one, except that every president has been a millionaire or a billionaire, and as we know, some of them have been very good. And the money doesn't seem to have gotten in the way, and some of them even instituted changes that affected some of their own business interests. Lyndon Johnson implemented the civil rights reforms, which were amazing, despite the fact that he himself was arguably a racist all the way through the end of his life. So people can do weird things, and you know, the assumption that bad people do bad things, rich people do rich things, poor people do poor things, and only good people can do good things is just fundamentally false. You know, we always speak about the road to hell being paved with good intentions, but the road to heaven might be paved with bad intentions. You know. Anyway, that's sort of in general. I think the question regarding Poroshenko, which is what you're asking about, of course, is really can only be answered in terms of, well, what's the record? I mean, let's see, you know, what has he done? I mean, what has been done under his tutelage? That's, I think, a more appropriate question in the last 3 years. And how does that compare with stuff that's being done or that has or has not been done in Ukraine in the past? And how does that compare with stuff that is or is not being done in other countries, in the immediate neighborhood of Ukraine, and perhaps even elsewhere? And I think from that point of view, I think the answer has to be that a lot has been done, an enormous amount has been done, of a positive nature. Could it have been more? Of course. Could it have been significantly less? Yes, and that's what we seem to forget. A lot has been done. Has more been done in the last 3 years than in the last 30? Well, you know, Natalie Jaresko's famous claim is that we've done more in 1.5 years than in the last 25, and she was right. And even in the last year and a half, I mean, it's not as if everybody's just been sleeping Ukraine. They've been adopting reforms. It's just that they're not as sensational, and they're a little, you know, for every step forward, there seems to be half a step backward. So it's a little more complicated, the whole thing. How does Ukraine compare to its neighbors? Pretty good. Pretty good, you know. And then when you ask yourself something like this, you know, which countries were, you know, always perceived as being the models, which East European post-communist countries were perceived as the models for everybody else? Well, the answer to that was always twofold. Well, it's obviously Poland and Hungary. They've consolidated democracy, they've consolidated the market economy, they have strong civil societies, and they're fully committed to to rule of law. And yet, you don't have to look closely, you just look superficially. Hungary has been dismantling its democratic institutions for the last 10 years and has essentially adopted a policy of ethnic chauvinism. Poland, under King Kaczyński too, has moved in this direction as well with enormous speed over the last 2 years. And all of a sudden, the two countries that seem to be the ideal students of democratic war are backtracking. How is that possible? They weren't supposed to do these sorts of things because, of course, we knew that change in both countries was supposed to have been irreversible. As it turns out, it ain't that irreversible. Now, of course, who knows what will happen 5 years from now? Maybe suddenly, maybe both of them will change. I don't think so, however. I think they're tapping into deeper things, which suggests to me that Ukraine's somewhat more halting, plodding movement, step by anguished step, may actually be the way to go. And one of the reasons why reforms, economic reforms, cannot be done even while promoting one's own economic interests is that many economic reforms go in tandem with the economic interests of rich people and others. I mean, we know that from history as well, and we know that from our own experience. There are some reforms that obviously contravene the interests of the rich, but there are many that do not, and those are certainly perfectly compatible. There is nothing about the privatization of enterprises or about the privatization of the introduction of private property in the agricultural sector that is necessarily inimical to the interests of oligarchs. It can be done. It may be inimical to the interests of certain oligarchs, but not necessarily to the oligarchs as a class. So, bottom line is, can it be done? Yes, it can be done. But the real question is, what has Poroshenko done? The question isn't, it's not a theoretical question, it's a very practical question. And the only answer to that particular practical question is to look at the record of change over the last 3 years and to ask yourself, has Ukraine changed? Has Ukraine changed in a positive way? Has it changed more or less in the last 3 years than it has in the previous 25 years, and so on? Has it changed more or less than its neighbors and things like that? And my sense is that when we look at the question from that point of view, the answer is there's been a lot of change, a lot of positive change, more change in Ukraine than in most of its neighbors. And in general, Ukraine is actually doing quite well as a result of the changes that have been introduced. Now, are they enough? Probably not. But they are certainly sufficient to keep it moving in the right direction. And it's always that matters. It's the question of where you are today compared to where you were, and Ukraine has moved enormously, and is it moving in the right direction? And that's the key. And I think under Poroshenko, we've seen that those changes have in fact taken place, and that Ukraine overall is moving in the right direction. Not every single thing is ideal. We know that. But then again, where is every single thing ideal? One has to, in other words, look from a certain semi-objective point of view and keep all of these complexities in mind. And when one does, one sees that he's probably done a pretty good job. Not a terrific job. I wouldn't give him a Nobel Prize for what he's done, but certainly a pat on the shoulder. Good. I am living in New York, in the United States of America, which has been ruled by millionaires for how many decades? And I just don't mean presidents. Just about every member of Congress, and certainly almost every senator is a millionaire. And America has many problems. Overall, it's not a bad place to be. South Korea was dominated by these industrial conglomerates, as was Japan, for much of the post-war decade. And somehow, they managed to be market-oriented democracies. Germany, the same thing, post-war Germany. Sweden is still very much dominated by certain key families. So the wealth in and of itself isn't the issue. It's what you do around it. It's how you treat these people. And there Ukraine has had some problems, but it's not that I'm not a supporter of Trump, and I find the discrepancy in wealth to be somewhat obscene. That said, you can still live in a decent society and still embark on change, even with those people around. And again, all of history is testimony to that. That's really the bottom line. You've got the weight of history, and then you've got, on the other hand, Ukrainians who increasingly are seeing their own country in these Manichean terms. You either believe that reform is taking place, such as me, or else you believe that nothing has changed and that everything is lost. In other words, it's either white or black, right? I'm arguing that actually it's a lot of gray, and the gray is pretty good. Compared to black, gray is pretty good. But people just don't want to see the gray. They insist on complete white, and there isn't any. And if it's not completely white, it must be completely black. And that's just, first of all, that's absurd. That's absurd. It is understandable. I understand people are frustrated and they're angry and all these sorts of things. But it's a totally bizarre Manichean view of politics. And you see this reflected in some articles and blogs by Ukrainian political analysts. Andreas Umland made this point. Others have made these points. They don't talk about the Poroshenko government. It's now a regime. They compare it to Yanukovych and Lukashenko. Umland and others talks about a patronal system in place. And the implication is that suddenly Ukraine has become this feudal authoritarian state with huge landlords, magnates, and everybody else has been transformed into a serf. Really? Again, maybe I'm hallucinating when I go to Ukraine and I read about it, but I see a thriving, crummy democracy that is moving in the direction of an increasingly freer and more prosperous and self-confident society. In any case, if people truly believe that nothing has changed and that all is lost, they should draw the logical consequences of that and invite Yanukovych back. Because obviously Ukrainians are, from that point of view, Ukrainians must be completely incompetent, totally incapable of instituting change. And if there's no difference between Poroshenko and Yanukovych, why not just go for the real article? Invite him back. But of course no one would dare do that, and I think people are arguing in bad faith. They know things have changed. But in order to promote their own political agendas, it's obviously necessary to say, as did Donald Trump in his inaugural address, that there is carnage in America.